end-of-life options and thinking about death, talking about death, should not be limited to a healthcare setting or even a spiritual setting, that it should be very broad and expansive. And so we want to embrace culture and art, but we try fundamentally to respect people's autonomy, and that respect should span living and dying.
Hello and welcome to the Completed Life Initiative's Indigenous End of Life Symposium. This symposium asks the question, how do we elevate and amplify Indigenous and Aboriginal end-of-life experiences from around the world?
Your presence in this virtual space means a lot to us, and we're grateful for you tuning in today. Be sure to stay till the end of this presentation, as there will be an opportunity for you to join one of our speakers and your fellow symposium attendees at our community talking event.
In this first session, we are especially grateful to be sharing the wisdom of a few individuals who are themselves Indigenous to Canada, specifically the Métis Nation of Alberta, Red River Métis Nation in southeastern Saskatchewan, the Tk'emlúps-Teshkwepik Nation, and the Kootenay Boundary First Nations people.
We'll begin with a conversation between Jo-Anne Gottfriedson of the Tk'emlúps-Teshkwepik Nation and Jennifer Mallmes, located in the Kootenay Boundary. Later on today's session, we'll be joined by a Métis woman, Bev Cardinal, and a Métis palliative care doctor, Alex Kmet, who will share their individual experiences around traditional ritual dying practices and end-of-life healthcare decision-making.
Our speakers will reflect on how we can ensure that Indigenous communities, nations, and territories worldwide receive the recognition they deserve, especially in crucial areas like end-of-life healthcare. They will speak about open windows and the gift of laughter at the bedside.
Thanks for joining.
This was Jo-Anne Gottfriedson to Tk'emlúps-Teshkwepik, Aka Queenston. I'm happy to be here today, and before we start a session, I'd like to start out with our traditional prayer, and then I'm going to light a candle so it'll guide us through our spirit, through our discussion, Jen. So I'm just going to light the candle first of all. Kalkupi, Kukstaku, Okwada Staminal Internet. Kukstaku, Okosaltinsko. Kukstaku, Itlins, Milaminsko, McNaskins. The sound to you coming to Kosaltinsko to Kalkupi. Kukstaku is Lata Betinism, is Lata Guzman, he ought to Sumax Kalkupi. The sound to the Kalkit Milk, Kosaltinsko, Kunukans, Lafapin, Amakakluts. It's Jack Okosaltinsko. Thanks, Jen, for being here and allowing me to share that prayer and calling upon our ancestors to be here today. I'm Jo-Anne Gottfriedson. I'm from Kamloops, British Columbia, Canada, and I and Jen have been working together for a few years and sharing the end of Indigenous life. I present from a cultural and spiritual perspective, so I wanted to connect with spirit this morning. So I'll turn it over to Jen so she can introduce herself.
Thanks, Jo. I'm Jennifer Mallmes, and I live in Grand Forks, British Columbia, on the hunting territory of many First Nation people. I am myself, I am from Newfoundland, and my grandmother is Mi'kmaq, and I come from Mi'kmaq ancestry. And Jo-Anne and I have been working together for about 6 years now, and it really is our passion work to bring Indigenous culture back into end-of-life care practices. And I'm so honored that I get to work alongside of Jo-Anne here, and we travel all across British Columbia and teach people in community how to care for their loved ones in community and how to keep them in community if that's their preference. And the reason we do that is because it creates that space for traditional practices and traditional ways and ceremonies to take place instead of transporting somebody for a medical event into a larger center where they may be disconnected from their families, from their community, from their traditions, and from their culture. And we know that we used to do this work. We used to all take care of our own. And death in my culture, and in my ways of knowing and being, isn't just medical. It's a very spiritual, emotional, and it's more than just taking somebody to a hospital and trying to make them better. It's about taking all of the cultural ways and the spiritual ways and bringing them to the person so that they have a complete sense of life when they're leaving this earth and going into the spirit world. I created what was called the End of Life Doula program back in 2015 at Douglas College, which is the largest college in British Columbia. And I've been taking that program with instructors all across Canada. We've been in every province and territory except for Quebec. And FNHA, which is the First Nations Health Authority of British Columbia, they saw something in the program that they really wanted to take and indigenize, and they've asked Jo-Anne and I to travel around British Columbia and share this knowledge. So in this context, I'm not speaking on behalf of my ways, my Mi'kmaq ways. I'm speaking as an adult educator, and Jo is the spiritual and knowledge keeper for this. So yeah, we've been around for a lot of years. Hey, Jo?
Right. The End of Indigenous Life is such a beautiful program that we were able to train many people. I think there's over 400 people just in BC alone. And British Columbia is very diverse with very many variety of cultures and different, and our land is so huge that, and yet we still can connect with how we understand our final journey and how important it is, but more importantly, how sacred it is and how inclusive it is to our families. And as the individuals that are going on their final journey, it's their wishes and their plans that, and their what they want to do before they meet the Creator. And then the family are there to support and be with them at their time.
I'm
Well,
glad you said, you spoke about the diversity in British Columbia. We have over 200 different communities here in British Columbia that identify as First Nations or Métis. And each one of those communities has a different language, has a different set of cultures, has different medicines that grow there. And, you could be up north and have sage, and you could be down south and have cedar. So it's very different. So one thing that just popping on since you said that is that we are very homogeneous. We are not one size fits all. And you're absolutely right, Jo. Every single person has a different makeup that wants different things. We're not, everybody is unique, and somebody might want total religious and Catholic ceremonies because that's how they're connected, while others want full ceremonial rituals at the end of their life. Maybe you can share a little bit about that.
Mhm. Well, when we first, let's go back, when we started talking about the curriculum and the need to make it more indigenous, and the one word, if you remember, I was just like, I don't like that word, visualizing, because that's not what indigenous people do. We support, we're there, mind, heart, body, and spirit. So that, to me, that's not visually. And we had a big discussion, and now I'm really happy to say that that word is no longer in the curriculum, and that it's more supporting and helping our people understand the importance of being there, assisting their loved ones on their final journey. And there's it's such a beautiful ceremony, you know, like I really believe that the end of Indigenous life is such a sacred, blessed opportunity to be involved with and to be able to share and care with each other. And it's all, you know, the thing that I love the most about our ways is that it's ceremonial based, it's value based, it's belief based, and we're regaining and we're empowering our people to follow our own way of knowing, which is really, really important. And I love that. You know, I love the diversity and to be able to exchange ideas and say, hey, this is working for us and this isn't working for us. And how do we make it so inclusive and empowering to our Indigenous brothers and sisters and our relatives? You know, I think back about how important it was, you know, when I was a young girl, I was with my grandmother and my mother learning our culture and our traditional ways. And I was saying, well, why can't I play and run around like all the other kids? But today, at 71 years old, I'm really glad that I did have the opportunity to learn those sacred teachings and lessons from my grandmother and my mother, which led us into the path that we are. And, you know, like when I lit the candle this morning, to light our way and to be able to acknowledge our ancestors and you know that idea that how we came together and how we started working and making a connection with other Indigenous people in BC and having them have the opportunity to empower themselves and to really get back to our traditional way of caring and sharing with each other. It's so amazing, you know, because even those like 4 days of classwork, it's it's the clinical and the cultural and spiritualness molded and married together to make a program that enhances and empowers our people. And you know, it gives them an opportunity to, you know, there's a variety of teaching techniques. We use like videos, and we use one-on-one group discussions, writing out a plan, and you know, and one of our favorite things that I enjoy, like how you've brought in Zane to, you know, because we don't talk about death till it's right at our door and we're facing it. And now with this end of Indigenous life, it's awakening our spirits and allowing us to freely talk about it and prepare, you know, like who'd ever thought I'd be sitting in a classroom talking about death and how do we prepare for death, and having a funeral director come and share ideas and be very, very culturally adapting. And that's all I knew because you brought him in, you know, and I'm still connected to him after all these years. I just seen him last week.
Well, maybe we should talk about a little bit about that and about how the course has developed and a little bit about the program. And you mentioned it was a 4-day program, and it is 4 days, 24 hours over 4 days. And we bring in speakers such as Zane. Zane is the owner of Ancient Burials here in British Columbia and Omega Mortuary Services. And he comes in and he talks about the things that people don't want to ask. And the whole premise, the whole first day of our course is basically talking about things we haven't talked about. And you said something about, we don't talk about these things until it's too late. And we absolutely don't. And sometimes that's cultural based because people don't, it's a taboo to talk about it in your culture. And for others, it's just a way of life. They're not used to speaking about it, or they haven't heard about it growing up as a child. And I think the program itself, number one, besides the empowering and the educating, is that it provides a space for participants to come in and explore and ask questions around what can I actually do? What can't I do? Why can't we smudge in a hospital? I see you're smudging here. There's some hospitals that the fire alarms would be going off if you were doing that. But the more that we talk about it and learn how to advocate for ourselves and for our cultural practices, the more that the healthcare staff as well are really engaging. New hospitals are being built with rooms that you can smudge in, with cultural, spiritual rooms that the families can gather, because when somebody's dying in First Nations, everybody comes, the whole family comes, everybody comes, because it is a ceremony. It's a special time of life. There's going to be loud music. There's going to be drumming and singing and smudging, and the health authorities here are being very adaptive to that. And they're creating these spaces, or at least coming up with ideas. So if you can't do it in the building because you'll set off a fire alarm, there might be some outdoor space like a gazebo or something where the person can go out. And they're engaged. The healthcare staff is taking a step as well, because they're engaging in cultural safety practices. They're doing education around, well, what does it look like to be a patient and be First Nations? Because let's think about it. The way people die in First Nations isn't the way people die in the rest of Canada, and I can only speak for Canada. Most deaths are unexpected deaths, and rather than even in a white Caucasian person's family in Canada, the number one death would be cancer, right? So there are some differences on how we die. There's also differences on how we live and how we've grown up. And there's a lot of colonial practices that have shut down First Nation ways of doing and being. So there's that. And having trauma-informed care practices and educational opportunities for the healthcare staff has really improved that. Also, just the fact that a lot of First Nations people live rurally. So it's not that you can go down the street to the hospital or take a half an hour taxi ride to a hospital. Sometimes hospitals are 6 or 7 hours away down a dirt road. And if somebody is dying, that's not how they want to spend the last hours of their life. That's not how their family wants to remember them. So if we can empower them and give them the tools to care for them at home, if need be, if it's expected, if it's unexpected, you're going to do whatever you can do to get that person to first aid or medical attention. But if it's an expected death, here in BC, we have a protocol that you can die in your own home, and you can not have any medical intervention, and you do not even have to call a coroner or the police or 911 when somebody dies. We have what's called an expected death in the home. And when someone dies, the family gets to call time of death. And after 1 hour, or within that 1 hour, they let the funeral home know that somebody has died. Now, in a First Nations community, that can be really helpful, because you're not sending somebody to a medical facility only to have them sent back and then sent somewhere else. Really, it's you call the funeral home, and the funeral home usually knows what the cultural expectations are in that community. When Joe was talking about Zane serves Matsquim mostly down in Vancouver, down in the UBC area. And they know, and they trust that he knows that there's going to be certain expectations and certain needs for their community. Whereas if he was in Kamloops, where Jo-Anne lives, there's a whole different set of needs and expectations. And the funeral homes there know that there are things that need to be done, such as a 4-day wake. Do you want to talk about the 4 days, Joe, maybe?
Sure. Before we get there, like we do have a 4-day period where it gives the families opportunity to be engaged in the grieving process. And those 4 days is an opportunity for the family to prepare their final ceremonies for their loved one that's gone on their final journey. And they also have ceremonial things that they need to take care of. For example, when my mother passed away, like I think it was 40 years ago now, she one of our customs is that we cut our hair because our hair is like the umbilical cord that connects the mother and child. Our hair connects our mother to us spiritually. So when our mother leaves on her final journey, the immediate children cut their hair because it cuts off the ties of the mother, and now they're on their own. When our father dies, we cut our hair, but we don't have to cut it right off. If we had a sibling that passed away or our grandparents, we cut our hair. Or if we had a child, we would cut our hair. But if it's like a cousin or someone like an adopted individual, we can trim our hair. And we only selected ones are allowed to put their braids in with their mother, because she takes them to the creator and speaks upon to the creator and ancestors about that. And the 4-day week, there's a sacred fire that's lit that I lit here today. And only men are to look after that. And women can sit around it and offer tobacco, and they do the food burnings, because there's meals that are spiritual foods that are prepared morning, noon, and night. But we don't feed the ancestors at night. And then the 4-day gives people, relatives and extended family and community members to come and pay their final respects. And on the 4th day, and if it's an elder, they're usually buried before 10 o'clock in the morning, but we never have funerals after 4 o'clock when the sun goes down. That we have to wait till the next day. And there's a lot of rituals and ceremonies that take place during that sacred time when families, a loved one is left. But the one thing about a wake, if you ever have an opportunity to go to it, Jen touched base on it about how we visit each other and we feed each other and we support each other. But and we sing and we have ceremonies, but you'll always hear laughter. Because humor in our way of life is really important for us, because it's a way to let that hurt out and that stress by the gift of laughter. And they talk about stories about that individual, and they talk about silly things that they had an opportunity to share with. And then it's inclusive. The only time that it's not inclusive is that only if you really go to a traditional person's family in my nation, only the immediate children are allowed to be there. And pregnant ladies must wear a blanket over them, because we believe that children are very sacred and they can see spirit. So we want to protect them at all times. And also ladies on their time, and when they're in their moon, we call it their moon, or in mainstream administration period time, it's important for them to protect themselves and others, because we believe that women are very powerful. So our thoughts and our actions will greatly affect someone else. We want to protect our loved ones and people. So often there's a red paint that they put on, or a red cloth, and it's only for the creator and the ancestors to see, not important for us. Only if there's a blanket, you'll notice that a lady's pregnant and protecting the child. And then after the funeral and the burial has taken place, there's a huge feast where everybody joins at dinner. And then in Shawet Makulo, we play Slick Mouse, which is a stick game, and the family will put up, could be money, monetary gifts. I know when our dad passed away, we put up a horse, complete saddle, bridle, everything, boots, hat, everything, because we come from the horse spirit clan. And we put up money, and we put up canned goods, and we gave many things away. And then after that 1 year, the family has 1 year to mourn, prepare themselves to live, to continue to live, to have the courage to continue to live, but also knowing that they are in mourning. So in that time, we don't dance. If you're a traditional dancer, you don't dance. You don't pick medicines. You don't hunt our fish because it's the family and extended family's responsibility to take care of you and your family during your grieving time. And people are not allowed to ask you to get up and speak at public gatherings or to dance, and nobody can get married and nobody can have big celebrations during that time. And that's just in Swetmakulo. And you'll find Salish people carry that same thoughts. And then after the 1 year's up, oh, before we go there, some people will cover all the mirrors, and they put away all the pictures of the loved ones that passed away. And then 1 year after, they can bring them out and celebrate as they go forward. Then they can get it blessed and they can put it back up. And there's so many rituals and so many ceremonies that a lot of our people still engage in and are relearning how to bring our culture back. Because it's really important that a long time ago, through Christianity and adoption of colonization, our people learned a new way because we're very spiritual people. So, in fact, there was a law that prohibited us against having ceremonies, the potlatch law and the Sundance law. So now we can freely do that again. So a lot of our people are doing, engaging in our ceremonies and gathering of our medicines and bringing back that tradition, and I think about when someone dies and they're preparing for that. And that brings me to another step is that we prepare and, we think about it and we encourage our students to start thinking and having healthy engagements and discussions about how do we prepare for the end of life's journey? What's important to you? I just want to share a personal story. My youngest daughter, I had a meeting with her after Jen and I taught this for a year, and I thought, I need to get a plan of action for myself because, I'm there helping everybody, but what are my final wishes? So I talked to her about that, and I really encourage her, this is what I want. This is, even to my funeral, to the speakers, to the food, to everything. But not once did I ever think that my daughter would end up in intensive care and I would have to make those life-ending decisions for her. I prayed long and hard for that. And I had every faith that no matter what, she would come through. And they called us and asked us to make a decision to put her on life support. And I talked to her. It was like Zoom. Thank God for Zoom. They wouldn't let us go in and see her. And then I said, babe, what do you want? And she goes, Mom, do not put me on life support. I want to fight. Wait till the end. She says, do not allow them to do that. So I said, okay. And the doctor, he was Indigenous and he was in there and he brought sweetgrass into her and he prayed with us. And I said, you'll be okay, babe. But that was very, for me, who's very educated and am teaching the end of Indigenous life, to be faced with making a decision about my baby girl was hard. So from that, I really encourage our people, Indigenous people, to have a plan of action. Because a long time ago, our people prepared for their final journey. A long time ago, our elders, when they got old, and our people were nomadic in the spring, summer, and fall. And in winter, we had winter dwelling homes. But when the elders knew it was going to be their time, they'd often leave our clan and be by themselves or let the people go ahead. And they knew and they prepared their family. So when I think about that and what we're teaching today with the end of Indigenous life is encouraging our people to prepare and to really express what their final wishes are. This is the opportunity for everyone to really think about what's important to you. And we think about the heart, the mind, the body, and the spirit. They're all married to each other. And it's important to really think about that. And, as, things have changed, and I just thought about what you're saying earlier, Jen, about, um, there's a couple of remote communities that have their own little morgue in their community where the women wash the body and prepare the body. But those are, the ones that are expected to death that don't need a coroner or toxology or things like that, and they prepare everything in their community because you can either fly in or boat in. That's it. So those are really important for us to share and to understand because it's not one shoe fits all. It's very diverse and very beautiful. The ceremonies and the way we prepare our people is very beautiful. um, what are some things that you've seen through your time, Jen?
Wow, that's a big question. I've been doing this work for 26 years now. I started off in nursing school and I didn't like what I was seeing. Um, I didn't like people feeling like they didn't have a choice but to die in hospital, and that families were restricted in how many people came, who came. I remember my stepdad having a heart attack probably in I would say 92. And my mom and him hadn't been married at the time, and they wouldn't let my mom in because they weren't married. And seeing things like this in my nursing career just didn't sit with me. So um, my educational background is that I went and I did gerontology degree and I specialized in death and dying. And then over the last 6 years, I've really focused in on Indigenous end of life practices and end of life um, traditions, and not just after the death. And I love that you incorporated it all in there. So when we're working an Indigenous end of life guide, kind of like an end of life doula, kind of like a birth doula. If you don't know what an end of life doula is, it's a person who helps someone plan for their best, uh, the best death that they can have, and that looks very different. The type of death that I would want and that Jo would want would be totally different. However, we're not going to romanticize it because we don't always get that, but we can always plan for the best and hope for the rest as well. So having, Jo mentioning that planning is huge. So like a birth doula plans for the birth of their baby, an end of life doula or an Indigenous end of life guide help start those conversations for people to have um, a space to talk about what their wishes are. So what are their hopes? What are their fears? Are they afraid to leave loved ones behind? Are they afraid that there's going to be pain? Are they afraid of being alone? We help address all of these fears, put it into a plan of action. We talk about who you want there spiritually. Do you want an elder? Do you want a priest? Do you want full ceremony? We talk about those things. We talk about emotional support. What are their favorite smells, tastes? Do they like to be touched? Do they like their hands being held? Do they want their feet rubbed? And I remember having a birth doula myself, and I'm trained as a birth doula as well. I didn't want my birth doula anywhere near rubbing my feet. But even the little details, we get to really dive in with them and explore with them. What kind of music do they want? Do they want AC/DC or do they want traditional drumming? Because there's a big difference, and if whatever's going to bring them comfort at the end of their life. So we plan for these things. We plan on who they want there. Do they want their whole family there, or do they want a few people there? Do they want certain people not there because they know that it would interfere with their journey? And we do consider it a journey. It's not an event. It is a full journey through from birth all the way through illness and then to death into the spirit world. And Jo talked about what happens after somebody dies. The family gathers for 4 days. The family will light a fire in most First Nation communities all across Canada. The fire, the lighting the fire is is pretty standard in some communities, such as in Quebec. The fire is lit for 1 day rather than 4 days, and people are buried before sundown. So different places have different timelines and different things that go with it. So Joe was talking about, you know, this is what we do, and then at the fourth day there's a celebration and there's a giveaway. And when Joe was talking about her family putting up their dad's horse, basically that's an auction. So they auction off things to the people who were at the funeral, and that helps pay for the funeral, and that helps provide the family that's left behind some funds to help them, you know, get through this time. It could be a really hard time if that was the family breadwinner, if it was the main person in the family that made an income. So that really can help. And then after, you know, we, in our beliefs, is that this is a journey that doesn't end with death. We're moving into the spirit world. So very different. We have these conversations. We try our best to get to know what makes people tick, what's going to bring them joy, what's going to help them feel like they've had a complete life. But not just them, the people left behind, the people who are there witnessing and you know, in helping with these ceremonies and traditions and the grief and bereavement things that you do, like you don't hunt and fish and pick berries and medicines for you're putting pictures away. We're helping guide them as well, so that their memory of those last few days or that last year are protected. We want their memories of their loved one to be the best that they can be as well. So just recapping kind of where we're going with this, what have I seen, Joe asked, and I've seen huge changes over the last few years since the Indigenous end-of-life guides have been popping up in rural communities. I get phone calls from students time to time saying, we kept so-and-so home, you know, and it was glorious and it was awesome. And I think that once we demystify death and start talking about it, it becomes less scary. Death is not usually painful. Death is usually quiet and calm. And if you have one person that has training in the room that helps set that tone and helps, you know, normalize what's happening in the room, then that makes the whole world of difference for that family. Instead of them trying to figure out where they're going to stay, how they're going to pay for their gas or their flights, and then hotel down in, you know, 8 hours away at the main hospital, they're there with their family in the room, being able to be present with them. And for me, that's the best memories that I have of the program, is when I get those phone calls, Joe, and saying, we didn't transport, you know, so and so away, you know, we did this our way. And it's actually today is the 30th anniversary of my grandmother's death, and my grandmother was able to die at home, and we got to be there with her and have what she wanted happen. And we did the 4-day wake, and you know, we incorporated our traditional practices into it. And at that time, I wasn't even, I was just young back then, and I didn't know we could keep someone at home. But that's another part that we're bringing to the program, is that people don't know that you know, death is not always a medical event, or people don't think of that because we've medicalized death so much that we expect that, oh, of course you're going to go to emergency, of course you're going to go to the doctor, instead of accepting death as a part of life. And also, Joe was talking about the funeral homes. A lot of people don't know what they can and can't do, and what their rights are uh, as people, and who owns their person once they dies, and who gets control over their person when they die. And it really does depend on what funeral home you use to see what kind of business model they have. If they're inclusive and they say, you know what, come right in and we'll set you up in a room where you can wash and dress your loved one? Or do they say, no, we'll pick them up and we'll call you when they're ready? You know, you really want to have a good relationship with your funeral home. And if the funeral home in your community isn't working for you, there is nothing saying that you have to use that funeral home. You can use another funeral home. So, yeah. Did I sum it up okay there, Joe?
You sure did. You know, and that brought something to my mind is that, you know, as our people don't want to die in a foreign, not a foreign facility like a hospital or, you know, because it's so sanitized. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being very clean, but a lot of times our loved ones want to be at home, you know, and they want to be surrounded by their family, their their own bed, the smell of their home, their traditional instruments, you know, and the other thing that made me think about how important it is for that is that even if they for some reason have to go to a hospice or palliative care, now I see more non-Indigenous people engaging and supporting our culture and our way of being. I've been supporting a few people at the hospice here, and as they're going on their final journey, and I seen the staff very curious, but you know, I don't know. So it's one day I said, hey, would you like to be smudged off? Would you like to join our prayer? Can we? I said, yes, you can. And so they came in and they heard us sing, they heard us pray, and we always have, you know, knowledge keepers, spiritual people there that take care of the ceremonial part. And it's usually in our language, and for them to understand and be part of that, it really created a better understanding and a bit more respect for our ways and our culture. Even to the point where after the loved one left the hospice, I said to the one nurse, you know, after we're all gone, I said, I can come back if you'd like and just smudge out the room and clean it out to release his spirit. So I thought that's what I was gonna do. So I went up there and I was up, but I was not prepared to do the whole building. I was going to go into where the room was, but they asked me if I did that. And some of the other clients that were there were saying, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm cleansing and I'm praying and the release of the spirit. Can you do that for me? And I said, sure, but I'm not Indigenous. I said, it doesn't matter. You're still the child of the Creator. So it's creating awakening, it's creating inclusiveness. And, you know, my hope is that one day we're going to have a lot of Indigenous home cares where our people can go and have an inclusive area where families can just come and be there 100%, you know, because sometimes our people do need that extra medical help and the medication process. So we're not, you know, we honor that. And so we want to be part of that. So that
I was
whole
just
care
thinking,
system, the workers and that, even the doctors, you know, in
Mhm.
Kamloops, we have a huge hospital and we have a prayer room where we can take people there to smudge. The nurses will haul that the medical bed down, and they've often sat in and asked to be brushed off. And brushed off means to be cleansed spiritually. Usually, spiritual person will smudge you with the smudge that I have here today, and also we'll use an eagle feather because that's the highest respect that we can pay. Is that eagle feather? So we often encourage, you know, the professionals to join us. And even when we're saying goodbye, you know, the other thing that I really want to say is that when our relatives are on their final journey, it's such a beautiful sacred time. But it doesn't mean that physically, yes, they're gone, but their love and their spirit is very much alive. And they're gifted into that natural world to sit by the Creator, and they become our ancestors. They become our guides and our protectors, and they grant us clarity through prayer, through ceremony. So I think that, at the end of Indigenous life, for me, it would be a celebration of the achievements and the lessons and the blessings that I had in my lifetime, and that I can go into the spirit world with straight eyes and tell the Creator, I did my job and I did my best, and hopefully, to be able to help others understand that, and to encourage that, once our trainees have helped the family and the person has gone on a final journey in that final ceremony, it doesn't end there. The continuation, the support, the advocating for the family is really essential. And that's what our guides do. They advocate, they support, they're there 110%. And, say, make sure that you continue to work with the family after for 1 year. Be by them, encourage them to continue on their life, because that's what we do in our world, is that we achieve and we learn our lessons and our blessings, and we hope that the Creator, when we've reached that time frame, that He's going to take us home to our everlasting life.
Beautiful. You said so many things that I just wanted to jump in there and say, yes, yes, yes.
Mhm.
When you were talking about going back to the hospital and offering smudging to the nurses and to the room, and them being curious, I think that opens so many doors for just showing them humility and how we do things differently than they might, and giving them the opportunity to ask questions. I also realized that dying at home might not be, like you said, it might not be the best place for somebody. Maybe they don't live in a home that's equipped or big enough, or maybe they do need extra support. And dying in a hospice or a hospital isn't a failure. But there are things that you can do in a hospital and hospice to make them more like home. And one way that we advocate is that we encourage our students that come through the program to go ahead and talk to the hospices and talk to the hospitals before they need it, and let them know, hey, this is what we need in our culture. Can you support that? So having those conversations proactively rather than reactively when somebody needs it. And then the last thing that you were saying just now, that really hit home, was that our spirits live on forever, and there's that continual bond of them guiding us, and that with an Indigenous end of life guide, we also stay on for the journey, not just until the death has occurred or the 4-day wake has occurred or the potlatch lunch with the option. We stay on for a long time, hopefully for at least that year, and we check in regularly, because we know that grief doesn't always set in at time of death. Some people start grieving at diagnosis and they grieve the whole way and they work on that the whole way, and others start grieving at time of death, and about 3 weeks in, when people stop bringing over the casseroles or checking in on you, making sure you're okay, maybe it's time for you to go back to work, that's when grief might hit. It might hit 3 weeks, it might hit 3 months, it might hit 6 months, it might hit all of those times. And having an Indigenous end of life guide there checking in and saying, how you doing? How are you doing? And supporting them wherever they're at, because there is no linear, Kubler-Ross way of doing grief. Grief is messy, and we don't move on from grief. We learn how to live with our grief. And grief is not a bad thing. It means we loved, and it's that continual connection to that person that might not be physically here anymore, but spiritually we're thinking about them and they're in our hearts.
Right. And that leads us into having grief is a process of we loved and we were loved. And it's an opportunity for us to engage in creating and beautiful memories and stories, and just the opportunity to continue to, live your life. One thing that I said to my daughter, I said, is that I did it my way, there's my wishes, and that's important. And that's what I encourage you. Do it your way, have your wishes, and I'll follow them. Or you will follow me, I said to her. And that's important, because a long time ago it was such a taboo thing. Oh, don't talk about death, it's going to bring it on. But you know what? My grandmother, I remember her talking about me, and she'd say, Queenston, one day I'm going to leave you. And I didn't realize that what she meant, like, leave me, like, well, where are you going, Gran? Okay. And she said, one day I'm going to sit with the Creator, and I'm going to be watching down on you, and I'll be there at every ceremony, and it made me think, like, I was a young girl when she's saying that. So I tell my grandchildren and my great grandchildren, your gran, I'm 71 now. And, my life is just awesome, and you're such a blessing, and I'm so happy that you chose me to be your mom and your granny and your great granny. And I'll always be with you in spirit. Even my little great grandchildren, the youngest one is 2, and the oldest one is 30. So I'm talking to them about this, and I'm preparing them, because I think it's important for them, because it's not when you prepare them, it's going to be a lesser of a shock, right? And you want them to be able to accept your wishes and the Creator's wishes, and to be able to continue to live, laugh, and love like there's no tomorrow. If that was the final wishes I was ever going to say to somebody, is just that.
I love that,
For
Jo.
this moment, be thankful for this moment, and just hope that there's another moment yet to come. And I think this has been a great exchange of straight heart to heart talk, Jen. And I hope somehow we've ignited some thought, and continue to let that heart grow with love, and to continue to burning with love, and to always see the light at the end of the dark tunnel. So
Yeah.
thank you for being here and sharing with me. I love it.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom on ceremony and practicing ceremony and beliefs, and what you've shared with your grandbabies now, that you're always going to be there with them. I think there's so much comfort in culture and our belief system that that I'm actually quite, I feel like other cultures might be a little bit jealous that we have these practices and these comforts and these ceremonies and these ways of thinking. It just does bring so much comfort to me, and it's always great to spend time with you and just chat about our passion work. And thank you so much for sitting with me today. And yeah, yeah, thank you.
You take special care.
You too.
Hello, my name is Bev Cardinal, and I'm a Métis woman living in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I come from a long line of Métis ancestors who originated in Red River, Manitoba, and who migrated and moved from Red River into southern Saskatchewan in the Qu'Appelle Valley. And it's from that line of Métis community and Métis families that that I originate from. I'm a mother of 2 adult people, 2 adult children, a son and a daughter, and I'm a grandmother to a beautiful granddaughter. I have lived in Regina, Saskatchewan my whole life. And it's from that lived experience and also my family history that I have come to begin my journey of discovering my Métis ancestry and what that means to me and my family. And it's an honor to speak with you today and share some stories about what it means to be Métis in Canada and in Saskatchewan, and particularly from an urban perspective as well. And I look forward to participating in this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Bev. My name's Alex Kmet. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, which is an organization representing Métis people in the province of Alberta, Canada. I grew up in a small town in that province, and now I live in Whitehorse, Yukon, Canada. Yukon is the territory next to United States, Alaska. We're a territory larger than most US states. It's 45,000 people here. We have 14 First Nations who live within our territory, and within those First Nations, there are 8 separate language groups, and they make up more than 20% of our territory's population. I myself live here and work here as a palliative care doctor. I've been here for 10 years, and my work in palliative end-of-life care touches not only on many different First Nations people and cultures, but is also informed by my own family's history and story. It's an honor to be here today, and thank you so much for taking the time. I think moving into just a bit of background, Bev, and I look forward to you expanding on this, just giving a bit of a sense of who the Métis people are, as they're a unique group within Canada's Indigenous people. So in Canada, there's First Nations people, there's Inuit people, and they have a separate ancestry and lineage, mostly in Canada's Arctic. And then there's the Métis people, who throughout history have been a blend of Indigenous and non-Indigenous, not only heritage, but cultures, and created their own very unique culture, their own language, but historically have been politically, culturally, and administratively seen as some sort of separate outsider. So the history of the movement in Red River, Saskatchewan that Bev you talked about earlier, I mean, that really speaks to how they were so maligned within the systems of power and culture that existed in this country, and also speaks to how they ended up spreading across the prairies in Canada as a way to find a home for themselves where they could actually have their identity and have their culture. That's a bit, I think, of the history. I'd love for you to expand on that, Bev, if you could.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Although there's, a large number of what we might define as mixed blood Indigenous populations located throughout the world, the Métis people in Canada are unique, very unique. It's taken me years of research to figure that out, what makes us unique, what makes us part of, so when we think about the political definition of who Indigenous people are in Canada, Alex has already described the 3 categories: First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. That definition is embedded within the Canadian Constitution. The Métis in Canada are very unique. We have our own language called Michif. There are still families, communities, and individuals who live very close to the land in 2024. And there are still quite a few individuals who still speak Michif language. We have come a long way as a Métis nation. We are now identified as nations within a nation. There are 5 Métis nations identified and accepted by the federal government as nations. So when we hear the phrase First Nation, most likely we'll now hear the words Métis Nation as a very distinct group of individuals and families and history.
The Métis people were subjugated to, the same sorts of racism and forced assimilation into Canadian culture that the First Nations and Inuit people were, but they also had their unique space in that. If you look at the Indian Act, if you look at the structures by which the federal government, quote unquote, manages Indians, the word that they put in law, they talk about First Nations and Inuit people, but Métis people generally weren't legally involved in a lot of those prior structures, but they were still subjugated by the same sort of racism that most non-Indigenous people applied. Métis people may not to the same degree have experienced directly Canada's residential school system, but they were equally torn apart as a culture and community by the same principles, or even by being in residential school as First Nations people were. For those who don't know, this was a whole program across Canada aimed at stripping children from their families and forcing them into schools where they gave them non-Indigenous identities and tried to essentially, for crude terms, remove the evil savage within. A lot of this was done with the assistance of many types of churches, and has caused lasting trauma through generations of people that shape how First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people interact in the world today, not just with their communities, but with our government structures and our systems of health. And one of the things that, as we talk about end of life considerations for Métis people, is an acknowledgement that they were their culture that they developed, their community that they developed, that was forcibly stripped away from them. And so they come from a place of trying to rebuild that with themselves and each other. And they come from a place where the very system that's supposed to care for them when they're sick was directly involved in removing their identity from them. So there's fundamentally this real erosion of trust in something that when you're vulnerable, you would expect you'd be able to give your trust into. And that really shapes a person's journey who is Indigenous in Canada when they get sick, and particularly shapes their end of life care journey.
The one thing that really sort of sticks out for me is that within our First Nation communities and nations, not only are there different languages being spoken within those different nations, there are different practices, traditions, protocols, ceremony. When I think about being Métis and attaching those, what I think are really relevant, spiritual, absolutely essential to our health and our last hours on earth as well. I mean, they're integrated. When I think about it from a Métis perspective, what Alex has just described, the impact of churches, organized religion, on First Nation, Métis, and Inuit populations in this country of ours. We still see it in a very strong way today. For example, here in Regina, the Archdiocese of Regina, which is the Catholic Archdiocese, has just agreed to organize what is being called an Indian residential school support group for survivors of the Indian residential school system. And these are individuals who were, as Alex described, children when they were removed from their families and sent away to residential school, and continue to be educated and live their lives under very strict religious rule. But still, when they became, older teenagers, young adults and parents themselves, began to struggle with their identity, with the loss of their family ties, the loss of connection to their communities. And so what we're seeing is a real movement, a strong movement from those survivors. And I think for us in 2024, the whole notion of community, what that means to us, how we get back to that, the importance of that is finally taken root again. And for me, as an urban Métis woman who I've had, as probably many of you have, multiple experiences with death over the course of my life. But I now have a very more, I think, holistic view of what that looks like. But it's not really based on anything specific related to Métis as much as it is to the whole idea of family and community and what that means to us.
Yeah, Bev, and I think, one of the things that I see here, in a territory with so many different First Nations people is for Indigenous people in Canada, that connection to community is just so fundamentally important as a concept related to healing. So, and I think one of the real big pieces to understand about whether it's First Nations, Inuit, or Métis people, even though they have very diverse histories, what is common amongst them is a connection to their home, the physical land that they spend time on, the community of people that surrounds them, and their stories. There's a history of who they are that gets passed down through story. That story has ritual to it. That story has the use of medicines taken from the land in it. That story has songs, dance, drumming. But community, the land, and the stories, those are the things that underpin all Indigenous people in Canada. And Bev, I've got two stories I just want to share that touch on
Oh, yeah.
different things,
Yeah.
if that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
The first is just to really outline the extent to which the residential school system impacted people. And I had this First Nations woman in her 60s who had advanced cancer, was in her last weeks of life, and couldn't get off the couch without help from her family. Her family was tired and she was not feeling comfortable, and she agreed to spend some time in our hospice for a period of time with the hope of giving her family a break, getting some extra care and support, and then maybe going home if she still had the strength and capacity. She spent 2 nights, and we're talking a hospice environment, right? This thing is designed to feel as home-like as possible. But all she could feel was that she was back in residential school. And even this loving environment of these caring people that doesn't have institutional barriers, or at least minimizes them as much as possible, there's enough institutionality in healthcare for that to remind her solely of all of this history that she had being away from her family and the abuses that were suffered there. And so she left. And thankfully, we were able to care for her in her home, and she died with her family. But I just wanted to share that one because it just really stood out to me, the degree to which that history shapes what healthcare looks like for Indigenous people in Canada now.
Mhm.
But the other story I wanted to share, just emphasizing people's connection to the land. So I had this woman in her 80s with a gynecologic cancer that had spread to other parts of her body. It wasn't curable. She was in hospital here in Whitehorse. She was born physically on the land by a river about 500 kilometers away. That's where she normally lived. And she was just too sick to go home at that time. Now, what commonly happens with these types of cancers is there was a very large tumor in her pelvis, pressing on the tubes that drain the kidneys down into the bladder. We call those the ureters. And when those get blocked, the urine backs up into the kidneys, causes high pressure, and that causes the kidneys to fail. So we were having a meeting with her family and her about treatment options. She wasn't eligible for chemotherapy type treatments, but we could place little tubes called stents through her bladder up into her kidneys to prevent her kidneys from failing. And this would potentially prevent her life from ending too quickly from kidney failure. The downside is the only way that we can do that is flying her 3,000 kilometers away to a bigger center. Then she'd have to fly back, and then she'd have to go 500 kilometers to her home, and every 8 weeks do that same trip over and over and over again. And when we laid all this out for her, she didn't even say anything, and she kind of smiled with a bit of a wink, and she just mimed shooting a moose. We were having this conversation back August, early September. And the point is, it didn't matter to her if her kidneys are going to fail sooner than not. What mattered to her is that she got back to her home and she could go on a side by side and try and shoot one more moose with the time that she had left.
Mm.
I know this little 80-year-old First Nations woman. And so she decided to say, look, I'm going to focus on what matters to me, which is the land that I was born on, my family caring for me, and doing what my culture is, which is the rituals of being out on a land in the middle of northern Canada. And she ended up dying in her own home, in her community, on the land that she was born on with her family around her. I don't think she got a moose, or if she did, someone else did all the work. But that story, I think, emphasizes the degree to which our Western way of looking at the world really is very material about the body, but connection to community, connection to land, and connection to culture. Like culture truly is medicine, and real healing for Indigenous people requires actively participating in all of those parts of who they are as a people. And if that part is taken away, then they don't actually heal. I don't know, Bev, how that fits with you, but
Oh, that's just a beautiful story, Alex. I just love that. I love that. It really resonates with me. As an urban woman, um, I'll just share a couple of stories. Like my first real, my mother was Scandinavian. My dad was Métis. My Scandinavian grandparents homesteaded in central Saskatchewan. They were enticed to come to central Saskatchewan. I mean, this is a long time ago, because there was homesteads that were being given away. If you were brave enough to leave your homeland and journey all the way to central Saskatchewan, just Google that on a map, and there were homesteads to be given away, and the condition was it was your land, but you had to survive on that land. So my grandfather and my grandmother left Sweden when they were 19 and 21 years old and made their way to central Saskatchewan near probably the largest community near their homestead was Outlook, Saskatchewan. And they literally homesteaded that land. They built a sod shack. Then the next year they ordered a house. You could buy a house from the Eaton's catalog and you could construct your home. And that's what they did. Just astonishing. When I think about that, and I think to myself, what industrious people they were, but also resilient. When I think about our Métis history as a family, we hear an Indigenous history, Indigenous populations, First Nation populations, Inuit populations. The word resilience comes up constantly. And so I make that analogy between my Scandinavian grandparents compared to my Métis grandparents, who, as I've described already, were not permitted to live in town, lived on a road allowance in literally a tiny, tiny home, probably a one-room house. The resilience that took to begin their lives together, to start families together, to raise their families to be hardworking, with a high value about hard work and industriousness. And so I see similarities between those two lines of my family. The first funeral I ever attended was for my grandfather, John Strand. Out on the land in the middle of the prairie, the community had constructed a tiny little church, a Lutheran church, and there was a cemetery there as well. That church still stands today. I went to that funeral, but I'm not sure I remember anything really distinctive about it, other than it was in the middle of the Bald Prairie, and it was really cold. I think it was 9 or 10 years old. When I was 14, the next funeral I attended was for my dad's mom, my Métis grandmother, who by the time she passed away had finally been convinced by her family to leave the valley, to leave Qu'Appelle Valley, to leave the road allowance house, to move into town. She reluctantly agreed to do that, but she was very specific about where she wanted to live in town. One of my older aunts and her husband, he was a carpenter and a home builder, and they had a shed in the back of their property. And my midship grandmother insisted that that's where she would live, in that one-room shed. And so my uncle constructed a space for her that was comfortable. They installed a wood-burning stove, a little bit of electricity. They hauled water for her every day. She grew the most massive garden that I've ever seen and the best raspberries that I've ever tasted. But that was my grandmother's. She just really didn't want to leave the land, but she wanted to maintain that link somehow to her lifestyle and her land. She didn't speak a lot of English. She spoke mostly Michif. And so when as kids, when my siblings and I were lucky enough to visit, because in those days you didn't travel a lot, even though she resided in a town that was just like maybe 40 minutes away from Regina, it was a big deal. It was a big deal to go and visit. And while our parents would, because many of my dad's siblings and their families lived in town, so visiting in town was a whole day because they went from home to home to home. My cousins and I and my siblings and I would hang out with my grandma. And it was just the most comfortable space. Winter, spring, summer, fall. It was the most comfortable space. She didn't speak a lot of English. She spoke Michif. So when you were in trouble, you knew you were in trouble whether she spoke English or not. When it came time for her, she passed away. Actually, she ended up agreeing to move into an actual house, probably 4 or 5 years before she passed away, with an actual flush toilet, running water, central heat, tiny, tiny little home. When she did pass away, what I remember about that period of time is that it was all about our families. All the families came together. And it was, my dad's family was a big family. It was a family of 10 siblings. And they came from all over, and he was the youngest. And so there were so many cousins that I hadn't even met. But it wasn't a particularly sad thing or sad event. It was just this, I remember lots of visiting, lots of laughter, and some absolute mourning and grief. But it was all linked together with this huge Métis family. And for me, those were my first experiences with death and dying. As I became a mother and then a grandmother, my own personal journey into my own Métis culture and my own Métis roots has taken me literally my whole life. I'm still on that journey. But I have come to appreciate the significance of having a spiritual connection, especially when in times of severe illness, health crises, having to make end-of-life decisions with family members or on behalf of family members. My former husband came from a huge Métis family. Both of his parents and in both the generations of Métis families in his family. 13 siblings, 13. And there's 5 left. And so we have had a lot of hard discussions. We've had a lot of grief and mourning. But the ones that were very, it didn't matter who it was, really, whether they had been gone for decades and came back to the land. The majority of the siblings that my ex-husband's family has lost have all indicated that they want to return somehow to the Qu'Appelle Valley. So that link to the land is huge. They have had ceremony out at their parents came from the Road Allowance, so they have had ceremony out on that land. And it's always been really, I don't know if the word celebration is a word that I should use, but it's not been like it's been, I think, fulfilling somehow. It gives me peace, it gives me comfort. I've been to many church-based funerals, church-based memorials. The comfort I get knowing my history, my practices now as a Métis woman, that's what gives me the most peace. And I think it is something that that in most Métis families, that's what we'll hear about, is those stories, and again, the link to the land, as Alex has described. Our culture is medicine, and that may not mean anything when you say that to certain people, but once you start exploring what that means, it's a very powerful way of living and decision making. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, Bev, I really appreciate the way you say that because it really emphasizes how culture is about doing and it's about being in it and it's about living and breathing it. It's not a category of things or a checklist that you can understand. It's something that you have to walk into openly and you have to be willing to accept. And I just wanted to tie a couple threads together here and mostly just for sharing with others who live outside of Canada, which is some of the understanding the history of oppression towards Indigenous people in Canada. And now that they're refinding their strength and refinding their culture, they're having to braid in the fact that they also are now part of a Western culture. And so that means it's never going to be the same as it was. It's going to be something new and different, and that new and different is going to be strong and it's going to be unique. Um, and it's not just within culture, from a healthcare provider's point of view, it's within how we approach healing. Uh, and so one of the concepts we often talk about in medicine is two-eyed seeing, and that's recognizing there's a Western way of looking at the world, and health, and there's an Indigenous way of looking at the world and the health. And both those things are not only complementary, but both those things are necessary to hold together at the same time. And so you look out of one eye with the Western world point of view, and you look out the other eye, with the Indigenous culture point of view, and those things together, equal and complementary, are necessary to make towards healing and health. And that's regardless of if you're physically actually healing from an illness or whether that's healing as the body approaches its final moments. And healing in those instances is often mending community ties. It is in participating in as much ritual as possible, and in connecting back with the land as much as a person can. I um, I think one of the things, just to share from an experience locally in our community hospital here, we have a First Nations health program that uh, cares for anyone who identifies as Indigenous. And so this program offers traditional foods. So they get bone broth, they get moose and caribou, bannock. It offers things like smudging with sweetgrass and special ceremonies that way. Recognizing how important community is, there's even a special family suite in the hospital specifically for Indigenous patients only, whose families generally come from a community and need a place to stay together and to be with their family together. I mean, it's common for me to have care discussions with non-Indigenous people. I might just do that on their own. I very rarely have goals of care conversations with Indigenous people where the room isn't full. And it's usually not the person who's sick who's being asked to make a decision. The group makes a decision. And so it's being able to acknowledge and respect those differences and being open to exploring that. That's been one of the unique things to see here. And I just wanted to share some practical things that I see here locally that honors our First Nation people here that we care for. Just the last thing I just wanted to throw out, Bev, before I hand it back to you for what else you'd like to build on, is there's so much diversity in this country, um, between First Nations people, Métis people, Inuit people. Every single of the 14 First Nations in the territory where I live has different rituals, stories, ways of approaching um, the end of life journey. But one thing I do commonly see, uh, at least among our local First Nations people, is the windows generally open. So it could be -40 outside and dark as all heck. And the window for someone who's approaching the end of their life is usually open, not just a crack, but a fair amount. Um, and that's to make sure that the spirit doesn't get trapped inside the house when it finally leaves the body. And I just wanted to leave that with people, the acknowledgement of how many unique differences there are, and also just some of the rituals that you might see, or at least some of the ones that I witness here at home.
Here in Saskatchewan, we have 72 First Nations. We have 12 Métis, Métis regions, and each of those include very, very different communities across the province. What I've noticed over the last probably 15 or 20 years is finally, at long last, an acknowledgement by the health sector in our province of the importance of making space, safe cultural space for Indigenous people. So, for an example, similar to what you've described, Alex, that's happening in the Yukon. Here in Regina, at both of our hospitals, the General Hospital and the Pascal Hospital, there is dedicated space to for Indigenous patients, care providers, family members, visitors to access to do the ceremonies similar to what you've described, Alex. Smudging, pipe ceremony, prayers, those kinds of ceremonies. So there's accommodation for that. Absolutely no question anymore. The importance of that is embedded now, and they're doing a fine job of it. There's also been movement, particularly around the whole notion of preparing and making sure that the broad healthcare workforce in our province is, at least somewhat educated about the uniqueness and diversity, as you've described, Alex, of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities, and what that means for the work that they're doing. It's an ongoing process, but at least it's happening. What I've experienced, particularly within the healthcare system, is the ability to get approval, for example, to go into the intensive care unit, whatever that looks like turn off the oxygen for 5 minutes or whatever they need to do to permit a ceremony to happen. So we see that happening, and it's progress. It's progress. Just that visual that you described of the open window, it's just such a powerful visual. The notion that, yeah, we may be in intensive care, we may be in palliative care in the hospital, in this brick building, surrounded by machines and equipment. But there's always going to be people with us, always. It is about connecting, not just now with our families at the end, but what we are looking forward to as we complete our journey on Mother Earth.
And one of the things is, how do people approach these settings in what's considered a culturally safe way? And it's mostly about your intention and the mindset that you have walking in. And fundamentally, there first needs to be space to acknowledge that someone's perspective on the world is going to have insight that's going to be different from yours. That is equally as valuable as whatever insight you bring in. So, as a doctor, like, the wisdom of the person that I'm speaking to is equal to the medical knowledge that I bring. And to be curious about exploring every opportunity that they present for you to understand better that perspective. So that with that, for example, particularly in the last days of life, many people may speak of people who've passed on, going on a journey, seeing spirits in the room. From a purely medical point of view, I have a number of colleagues who call that delirium.
Mhm.
in, which is a medical
Yeah.
phenomenon, very material, very biomedical, but you can explore a lot of those experiences with people so long as they're not distressed by them, and you can gain insight into themselves and their lives, and without embellishing anything that's false, you can really get a sense of who a person is by not categorizing what you witness into the biomedical framework. And so I think that intention, that curiosity with intention, uh, for anyone in this space is the fundamental thing that they need to walk through the threshold with. Or I think the opportunity to respect that perspective could be diminished. And then the last, I'm really curious to hear this from your point of view. The notion of a completed life, that just both from my point of view and from what I observe, at least among my family and among the First Nations people I work with, that seems more to be of a Western thing. It's the notion of a completed life seems like a bit of a retrospective and what was achieved or what was completed. Whereas what's most important is, am I fully connected to my family and my community and my culture right now? And I don't have many conversations about advanced care planning with First Nations people, for example. I don't have many many conversations about legacy projects, um, as compared to non-Indigenous people, uh, mostly because the focus is really anchored in culture, community, family, and so long as they're fully connected to that, they seem actualized, and they exploring it in conversation, it doesn't seem to expand. And so, you know, I think my observation of that, of actualization, seems true. So I think it's just a different way, a more in the moment, am I anchored in the grounding things that matter? That is complete. And
Mhm.
that'd be my reflection on a completed life from a Métis and Indigenous perspective. But I'd love to, I'm really curious to hear yours.
Well, I really agree with you. I think that um, the notion of completed life, I up until recently, it was something I struggled with. But one of the more recent losses in our family, um, I met with our family elder, and she just gave me probably one of the most powerful metaphors, um, that it's not that we're finished. It's that we're just sort of, we are now taking a different role. We now have a different role. So once our life on Mother Earth is over, our new role is to be one of those thousands and thousands and thousands of ancestors who stand behind the people living on Mother Earth.